So inside the Lords this week is inside the Lords because, would you believe it, it's snowing. That's typical for spring, but anyway. So it's actually been a busy week, and I'm going to rehearse something I've said before, but just to explain again how legislation is made, to explain why it's busy, which is when a law is passed in the House of Commons, it then gets sent over to the House of Lords so that it is scrutinised and amended. It then gets sent back to the House of Commons, where they debate whether they accept the amendments or not of the House of Lords, and any amendments that they don't accept get sent back to the Lords again in what's known as ping pong, and the Lords then vote again as to whether they accept, whether they want to stick with their amendments, and if they do stick with their amendments, it gets sent back to the Commons again, and then the Commons send them back again, and at some point somebody gives way. And obviously democratically, ultimately, the House of Lords has to give way, but in the process of that, sometimes they've worn down the government sufficiently that things can change. It's very difficult because at the moment I'm about to go into the reasons for consideration sent back by the Commons on the Police, Crime and Courts Bill, and one of the most egregious amendments that I still want to stick with is the right to protest, because I don't think there's any democratic mandate for that from the electorate, although there is from an elected House of Commons. And so it's hard to decide what to do, because I've already voted that it should be added or deleted from the bill. The Commons have sent it back, it's still there, and I might give it one more vote today, but then after that I have to give way. And that's got nothing to do with principle in relation to the issue, but it has to do with the principle of saying that ultimately the Commons are the people who are held to account by the electorate. But interestingly, you get into a different situation when something extraordinary happened this week, something, as far as I'm concerned, I'm proud of and proud to be associated with, which was in the Health and Social Care Bill. There was an amendment put in by Baroness Liz Sugg, who added that the government should keep the ability to have at-home abortion pills in the early stages of terminating a pregnancy. It would not make any substantial difference to the law. It was what's been done in, if you want, a forced trial during the lockdown. It involves telemedicine, which the government keep going on about the whole time as a brilliant idea, one of the things we've learned from lockdown. But the one bit of telemedicine they didn't want to keep was in relation to these pills. So Liz Sugg put in an amendment, and it was quite an emotive argument in the House of Lords, where, if you want, it started in the House of Lords. It didn't exist at all as an amendment in the House of Commons. It won through in the House of Lords, and I think we were surprised that happened. I voted for it and spoke on it. It then went back to the House of Commons, and what is exciting is that the elected representatives of the people in the House of Commons, having listened to the House of Lords debate, then decided that they would support this amendment. So they did. They voted on it yesterday, and now we have reinstated the at-home abortion pills. And it's one example where maybe the Lords does a good thing. Obviously, I agree with it, but which is completely democratic now because the Commons have agreed to it. You've also got a different dilemma I've been involved in this week, which is in relation to the Building Safety Bill. And I know that people have, maybe who follow me, a bit surprised that I've got involved in this discussion. It's partly because I'm a leaseholder and therefore understand some of the problems that leaseholders have faced in relation to the cladding scandal, the outcome of the fire safety regulations and building safety proposals, which will mean that leaseholders are facing bankruptcy if they were forced to pay that money. Now, what's happened here is that the bill was heavily amended by the government itself via the Lords. And what drove that is because since this whole issue has broken out as a scandal, there's a new Secretary of State, as in Michael Gove. Michael Gove looked at the original bill, said we need to do more to help leaseholders, and they added in, hundreds of amendments. So they amended their own bill, but they amended their own bill in the House of Lords. which meant that we didn't have very much time to scrutinise it or check it or what have you, and it's a bit of a dog's breakfast, if, in truth. Of course, that was where I made my big gain, and the government congratulated me that they had got rid of the building safety manager, which I had amended, and they said I was right, and they accepted that amendment. The problem was, and is, that even though they accepted that part, they then kept in a lot of the onerous duties that were being given to the building safety manager that now have to be done by someone, so you can just rebadge it. So, never think that you've done so well. But I don't actually think that, as some people are implying, some leaseholders have suggested this is like the government working in hand with big builders and construction and freeholders, and it's some sort of conspiracy to do over leaseholders. There's a carelessness there, but I do think it's just that it's bad legislation rushed through with the best intentions, because the government, I do think, are trying to resolve this problem. And so the government's suffered some very heavy defeats, and a lot of amendments have gone through from the House of Lords. And it will be interesting now to see how the government react to that, because those amendments were brought to the Lords. So it's not so straightforward how they come back to us in relation to whether those amendments stand at all. So we'll see what happens, and that's going to be discussed next week. As I've indicated, this is all because we're coming up to Queen's Speech time, and therefore effectively any legislation that is not gone through the full process before the Queen's Speech, as it were, falls. And I talked about the fact that I didn't agree with attempts at, in relation to the election bill, for example, attempts at filibustering, so it didn't go through. You have to have the democratic debate, in my opinion. Anyway, when the Queen's Speech happens, the Queen's Speech will then announce a whole new swathe of legislation, and some of it will have been in the last Queen's Speech. So one of the things which will come back will be the online safety bill, which I think is a major threat to free speech, as I've indicated before. But there'll be other aspects of the Queen's Speech which we're yet to ascertain. And what happens when that Queen's Speech happens, which I think is going to be on the 10th of May, is that for a couple of days the House of Lords is prorogued beforehand. Then when you come back after the Queen's Speech, there is a few days debating the Queen's Speech, where it's broken into sections. And I remember last year that I was here, but I didn't actually join in because I didn't really understand the process. And then after that, the legislative process starts again. But actually, it's quite slow because things have to go through the Commons first. So there will be some time in June and July which is almost fallow time and not used very productively, not used properly in terms of legislative time for the House of Lords. So I'm quite looking forward to that, because it will give me a breather and chance to really study the legislation that I'm going to speak on in some depth. In terms of the overall backdrop to what's happening in the world, I think that the issue of Ukraine is in danger of kind of being so normalised and, ticking on as kind of like, just part of the background, that we don't understand still or yet the seriousness of that conflict in terms of how it's going to, or likely to, reshape the world that we live in, because it's not happening in a short, sharp way. It doesn't take away from its importance. The only real discussion in relation to it in the House of Lords still remains the frustration around the Ukrainian refugees, which I understand the visas being slow, the homes for Ukrainians not really working as a system, typically overly bureaucratic, in my opinion. But the substance of the war is rarely kind of taken on board. And neither are some of the big issues that the war throws up, such as the way that there's a tendency in Western countries to use the war to, for example, pursue censorship. So one example of that is in Germany, the government have declared that they're going to ban the letter Z. Now, the letter Z is associated with fascist elements in Russia, and it could be seen as pro-Russian propaganda. But ultimately, it's a letter Z. And the idea of banning it, and it's so ironic because this is at a time when Germany carries on buying Russian oil, so there's some sort of posturing going on there, virtue signalling, but a dangerous attack in relation to censorship. And I still think there's not been enough fuss made in the UK about Ofcom's ban of RT Russia Today, not because I was an avid watcher, I rarely watched it, but because it's very important that we don't allow governments that are not at war to use a war in order to pursue illiberal agendas. And then I suppose finally just wanted to say something about COVID, which is that cases are going up. There's even some more people in hospital. But it just shows you how weird politics is, because that is true. And there's even been the fines issued to people from Number 10 and Partygate. And yet I was just on the tube and it's packed and people have got snuffles and people are, but they're carrying on, right? And so it indicates to you that there was something about that 2-year lockdown period, and even well after we had the vaccines, which were brilliant innovation that allowed us to be able to, even if we got the virus, not get seriously ill with it in most instances. That somehow, even though everybody knows there's more COVID around, even though everybody's got sniffles and snuffles and all the rest of it, we're all saying, yeah, well, you have to live with it, don't you? And what a great, blessed relief the human spirit is, that we have a sense of proportion now, but we actually were induced by the government to lose that sense of proportion, induced by the likes of Sage and Independent Sage to in some ways become overly fearful. And the thing that I would say, in relation to that, in relation to the Lords, is it is galling to have to listen to people, politicians, try and rewrite history about what they said in relation to lockdown. The claims by the Labour Party this week that children are suffering in education, this was in response to the government's white paper, and they basically implied that they had nothing to do with the school closures, where actually they were clamouring for them, and I had to listen to them doing that in the House of Lords. It's like as though they think we've all forgotten. But we should not forget those important political insights we gained during that 2-year period, but neither should we let the 2-year lockdown period define how we respond to issues in the future. I'm going to be busy next week with ping pong on lots of bills, and there's also the end of the elections bill. But one of the things that we are organising at the Academy of Ideas, very importantly, is a public debate on Ukraine. And it's actually about how the West has responded to Ukraine rather than the Ukraine war per se, but what it tells us about, for example, the German question in the modern era, what it tells us about Europe, the EU, but then Europe more generally, how we actually view the new geopolitical landscape. I'd really hope that you'll come along. It's on Wednesday the 20th of April, which is just after Easter. Put that date in your diary, Wednesday the 20th of April. We'll have a panel of interesting commentators, but as with every Academy of Ideas event, over half the time will be given to the audience, so it's very much a public conversation. And I can't stress strongly enough to you that whilst something that happens at the Oscars might get on the front, the headlines, whether it's the terrible scandal of the awful experiences in the Shropshire and Telford Maternity Hospital, which rightly are getting a lot of coverage, where women and their children died because of an ideological attempt at forcing women to have natural childbirth, or rather not to have C-sections, which is something we should be talking about. But nonetheless, the Ukraine war is important in a different kind of a way. It's not just one of those wars, so we need to understand it as fully as we can. So I hope I'll see you on the 20th of November, but before that I'll report back at the end of, the 20th of April. See, because it's snowing, I think we're in winter. But yes, I will report back next week, the final week before Easter of the House of Lords, in which we will be pinging and ponging lots of bills, and I will be trying to balance out what I ought to do as a Democrat in an anti-democratic chamber.